Hey, it's Mike. Welcome back to Fantasy Wargaming. Today's topic is going to be covering essentially my first list diaries with Kruleboyz so far in the lead up to Mancunian Carnage. I've played 6 games in preparation for this, in the lead up to list submission because I wanted to try and essentially decide what list I need to submit, and I wanted to share my experiences and thoughts based off of those 6 games, as well as run down what the list is currently. Now, disclaimer, this isn't necessarily the exact list that's going to get submitted. I may end up adjusting a few things, but the core of this list is likely to be submitted because I don't see any significant changes as necessary. A quick note before we continue. If you've been following the shorts I've been uploading for practice reports, essentially, you'll have noticed that I pointed out I quite enjoyed using the Incrondite incarnate of Gur, Cronspine incarnate of Gur. You may have been wondering, well, why isn't that here? And the exclusion is pretty simple, really. The TO for the event has banned the incarnate's inclusion on any lists. So it's not here because I don't have the option. I had a friend who's willing to lend me their incarnate for the event, but I decided, well, I'm not going to keep practicing with the incarnate if I know I can't use it for this event, when really the purpose should be trying to find the best list for that event. So for this video, I'm going to run down every element of the list and basically talk about what its function, what its purpose is here, and then go over any exclusions that other Kruleboyz armies may be taking which isn't here, as well as what's changed from the original list that I put together when the Twitter community first decided I was going to be bringing Kruleboyz to Carnage. And I suppose the best place to start this conversation really is talking about the number of drops in the army, because that ties in quite a bit to the subfaction I chose. So if you're not aware, Grinning Blades, the subfaction, means that your models are not visible to enemy models that are outside of 12 inches. And what that means in practice is most units have to get quite close to shoot, and because it's measured on a per model basis, there are actually some instances where they can't even necessarily get all their models in to shoot at the target unless they get it within that 9-inch zone, which then gives you the opportunity to redeploy. And what's nice about that is, you roll quite well on a redeploy, and you can re-roll that if it's issued from Gobsprak. You could potentially go from a situation where your opponent has to move in to shoot at you to you roll high and then subsequently move out of 12 inches again, so they just can't fire at anything. So to that end, I think it's important to talk about the fact I've gone for 3 drops. I've gone for as low drops as I can reasonably get while still including the units I wanted. And that's 2 battle regiments and then a leftover commander model, because I have 3 models that have 10 or more wounds, 3 heroes, that is. So I wanted to justify that. Well, the justification's pretty straightforward, really. If we have a subfaction trait that really, really punishes people who have long range shooting, if we're low drops, we can simply give them the first turn and largely be protected, insulated, if you will, from their shooting, unless it is extremely mobile or there is teleport shenanigans. And even then, we can do things with super sneaky to somewhat mitigate that if we know it's coming from a certain direction. Now, I've discussed with the T Sports Network Stats Center guys, Ziggy and Rob, about like the average number of drops that we're seeing in tournaments. And generally, the feedback seems to be that unless an army is going for a 1-drop list, everything in 1 battle regiment, typically you start to see armies at 3 drops or higher, with most of them being 7 drops or more. So by getting to 3, that gives me a very, very good chance of being able to dictate first turn order for every game. which just makes my subfaction all the better. And we'll get into the sort of the trade-offs when we talk about the core battalions later. But let's get into the details of this list. So the grand strategy is currently no place for the weak. I'm not entirely happy with that, but it is based off of playtesting, and it's based off the fact that Kruleboyz don't really have any fantastic options outside of no place for the weak. Their Galician veterans are quite weak, and your board control is a little bit suspect because you can expect to lose most everything other than some of your bolt boys over the course of the game, unless you're completely dominating your opponent. So the way I figure it, I've got 15 bolt boys in this list, and no place for the weak simply requires that I kill my opponent's battle line, all of it. And generally, killing my opponent's battle line is something that my army's doing anyway over the course of the game, so it doesn't really push me that far out of my way, especially when bolt boys are very adept at killing what stat lines tend to be battle line, you know, like the 4-up save, 10 wound kind of MSU style. There are flaws, of course, when you've got some armies like Nurgle who are throwing like 4 flies around where they've got a ward save, so the mortal wound output isn't as efficient unless I get nasty hex off. But still, at some point I have to make a compromise, and the way I figure it, no place for the weak is at least the one that I can most consistently score, irrespective of what models I have left, because Kruleboyz is a high damage output army, and a lot of my damage in this army has reach. It's able to project its power effectively. I'm going to skip over the triumph because I'm on 2,000 points on the dot, and let's talk about our leaders. So we have Gobsprak, a Sludge-Raker, a Breaker Boss, and a Swampcaller Shaman. Now, the Breaker Boss is here as a piece of tech along with Super Sneaky to give me some outs in situations where I don't get to dictate who goes first. Now, as I mentioned before, being able to control priority by outdropping my opponent is very important for a number of reasons, not least of which being obviously what I've discussed with the Grinning Blade subfaction trait, but it also means I control the proving ground. It also means I don't have to worry about getting double turned early game, which is really bad for Kruleboyz in particular. And it also means that my opponent has worse options for their first turn battle tactic if they can't just they're locked out of eye for an eye if they go first. Put simply, they have one less option. But as I mentioned before, there are some armies who are just going for a 1-drop army, or they're going for 3 drops and they may win the roll-off. And in those situations, I need to be able to have a productive first turn when my opponent makes me go first, because my bolt boys aren't in big yellers, so they're 24-inch range, and they can't move and still have that range. So my threat range is 24 inches outside of Super Sneaky. So how do I have a productive first round if my opponent, deploys back in their deployment zone and gives me first turn? Well, the Breaker Boss is here to present sort of a Sophie's Choice situation. I redeploy him with Super Sneaky to be 9 inches away from my opponent. That's what Super Sneaky does. It lets me pick up any unit in my army after everything's been deployed, but before the first player, that is the player who's going first, is determined. Put it anywhere on the board outside of 9 inches. So I pick the Breaker Boss here because if they give me first turn, yes, I may not necessarily get to fire at that many effective targets with the bolt boys, if any at all, and the rest of my army is quite slow outside of Gobsprak. But the Breaker Boss with Flaming Weapon excels at making his points back. So to give you an example, I played against a game recently where he was deployed outside of 9 inches of 20 Storm Vermin. I moved 5 inches up. I made a 4-inch charge. I managed to get Flaming Weapon off that game, and he lifted the 20 Storm Vermin turn 1 and turned a turn 1 that was otherwise uneventful because I didn't really do anything of note with anything in the rest of my army into the Breaker Boss traded up. My opponent had the Mire Brute in his deployment zone and couldn't simply ignore it. He had to spend most of his entire first turn basically just dealing with the Breaker Boss, which is really good with the Kruleboyz game plan because it keeps everything else alive a lot longer. And the last thing that a Kruleboyz player wants is to be double turned where they can bring most of your army to bear against your inner center. And by, let's say they do double turn you, if their entire first turn is mainly spent dealing with the Breaker Boss, then I've essentially reset it to neutral, if you will, because they can't do all that much with the double because they're outside of 12 inches likely with their shooting, so they can't just pick apart my my bolt boys. And because I know that they're going to be focusing down the Breaker Boss because they need to, because it's in their deployment zone, on their turn, I Finest Hour him. And because it's the first battle round, he's still -1 to wound because, of course, there were 4 dirty tricks, but really you're always picking with Kruleboyz the -1 to be wounded in the first battle round. It's just great. So it is very difficult for him or her to just straight up destroy the Breaker Boss without committing everything that they have to it, which just protects the rest of your army. And outside of that, the other thing to note here is Flaming Weapon, +1 damage on a weapon profile. If I put it on the clubs, he can have up to 10 Rend 2 damage for attacks, which is great at basically cracking open the armor of, free up save combat monsters. Obviously in situations where I'm going to expect to need the Mire Brute in those sort of situations, I wouldn't deploy him forward like that. It's worth noting that whether or not I use the Mire Brute in that manner over, say, a 10 Hobgrot screen just to kind of block them in their own deployment zone is based off of what I expect I will need the Mire Brute for in that matchup. The Sludge Raker, the thing that stands out as being different than usual is that he doesn't have Fasten, he has Smellion. For those not aware, that gives him essentially -1 to be hit in the combat phase, provided he hasn't charged that turn. And it's mainly here because it's to try and improve the survivability of him. Because he's an important buff piece, he's a high damage output unit, but he's only on a 4-up save. And the Grinning Blades protects him somewhat from shooting, but I found in playtesting I needed just a little bit of extra survivability from him so that he can stick around for things like scoring This One's Mine, the battle tactic for killing a unit with your general, because generally I'm not picking that turn 1 and he may be dead by battle round 3, so it's like trying to help stretch out my resources as long as possible. Shaman's here because I had 105 points left over and I think it's better than 10 more Hobgrots. He's mainly here for buffing the Bolt Boys, the unit of 6 Bolt Boys, to effectively double their damage output. I think for Carnage, I may end up swapping the spell for Levitate for fringe secondary reasons. I'm not going to go over the idiosyncrasies of the event pack in their totality, but essentially there is a reason for me to bring Levitate in my army, and it's not a high opportunity cost because typically Choking Mist would get cast by Gobsprak anyway. Speaking of Gobsprak, he's here. I don't love him in a world where there are mega casters running around like Thanquol, Teclis. I went over this in my previous video. However, he still has value in that he is a very mobile monster for Roar and Stomp and whatnot. He has reasonable damage output. He's great in matchups where your opponent doesn't have a Mega Caster. And finally, and most importantly, I mentioned it earlier, Grinning Blades works really well with redeploy because it could potentially protect your unit from being shot at full stop. And Gobsprak gives you that key reroll for the redeploy, provided he was the one who issued the command. Other than that, not much to say about Gobsprak. I love the hero. Him having the whole spell lore is great because all 4 of the spells have real utility. My battle line is 2x10 Gut Rippers with the hand weapons and then 10 Hobgrots. They're going to die Like, that's their lot in life. The Gut Rippers are hideously overpriced, but it's the cheapest configuration of battle line that Kruleboyz have outside of Big Yellows. And if they do somehow get to fight first, which they may do if I get a charge off with them and the Snatcher boss and use the Kruleboyz War, which essentially is like a once per game the lightning reflexes sort of deal with up to 3 units. They can still do damage because they're throwing out 21 dice, and if they're near the Sludge Raker, each 6 is 2 mortal wounds. So all you need is 2 3 6s, and that's six damage right there, which surprises people because they're otherwise quite unremarkable. And then the Hogwarts, the unit of 10 that are battle line, they're just there to be a cheap screen. I've got 10 more Hogwarts that aren't battle line. The reason why they're not battle line is it's a you may for each unit of Gut Rippers make a unit of Hogwarts battle line, and I believe the battle plan is no place for the wicked. I could be wrong there. It's the battle line where you score 2 extra points for every Galician veteran unit you kill, 3 if they're on an objective. And quite simply, like, you just can't afford to bleed that many points as Kruleboyz because generally your games are quite close anyway. And there isn't that much value in the Hogwarts being Galician veterans in the first place because a stray sneeze will kill them. And then the rest of the army is a unit of 6 Bolt Boys and then 3 units of 3 Bolt Boys. Bolt Boys tend to work better MSU. I've got 1 unit of 6 because I had the points for the Shaman, so might as well double the effectiveness of the poison buff. But otherwise, MSU gets you essentially more champions, and more champions gets you more shots. The other nice fringe benefit is it helps ensure that if you do get your inner castle charged, you can kind of have like a tiered, layered approach, so they don't tie everything up in combat all at once. I don't recommend it when you play Kruleboyz that you have everything clustered around close to the Sludge Raker, because the last thing that you want as a Kruleboyz player is to have all of your stuff in combat, especially when Bolt Boy units die quite easily. And because of Grinning Blades, again, you want to present a situation where your opponent can only really get in range to shoot 1 or 2 of the Bolt Boy units, ideally not 3 or more, so that you have the shooting necessary to then have like a proper counter attack. And then we have the battle regiments, the 2 battle regiments. Expert Conquerors and Bounty Hunters are just pretty much useless for Kruleboyz because Gut Rippers and Hogwarts just won't live long enough to really see value from it. Because it's a 5-up save, 6-up save respectively, and you just, yes, the Gut Rippers can do work in Bounty Hunters with +1 damage, but if they get charged, they're dead, so what's the point? We have Command Entourages and Warlords at our disposal if we wanted them, but the Kruleboyz artifact selection is pretty poor. It's very fringe benefits and nothing that really you want to consistently have in your army unless you expect like a heavy shooting metagame, in which case you may consider Mork's Eye Pebble. So I don't need a second artifact. So it kind of just makes our decision very simple. We run 2 battle regiments because we have 3 commanders. One of them has to go outside of the battle regiment. And that brings us to 2,000 points on the dot. So let's talk about notable exclusions. That is to say, what isn't here, which other Kruleboyz armies tend to have, and what has changed from the original list that I put in the army selection video. You'll note that the endless spells are gone. As I noted in my previous video, because of the mega casters running around, I didn't want to throw 110 points down the drain effectively, bringing Purple Sun and Cogs if I didn't feel confident that I'd be able to get them off in every matchup. And especially so because Gobsprak would be the one casting Purple Sun or Cogs, he wouldn't have access to Master Magic, so there's no reroll, and Purple Sun is a high CV spell, so unless your sequence is get Cogs off with another spellcaster and then use Purple Sun with Gobsprak, even then it's a bit clumsy because the Shaman typically wants to give up his spellcasting to give poison out, The breaker boss may not even be there to cast cogs, and if he is around to cast it, I kind of feel like I'd be better off casting Mystic Shield with him, defensively. Essentially, I just don't have enough casts in the army to really make significant use of it, combined with the Mega Caster issue. Other Kruleboyz players have had success with Kragnos. Why am I not trying to run Kragnos? Pretty simple, really. I want to play with Kruleboyz, and a Kragnos in a Kruleboyz army effectively just becomes a Kragnos list. Everything warps around him, and while I think he's a very cool unit, I'm not massively in love with the model. And at the end of the day, I want to play with units that excite me, and I just don't think that Kragnos excites me as a list builder. I haven't got a second Shaman. I haven't got any killer bosses. Reasoning being, generally, Shamans you want out of your army unless you're shooting for a warlord, because, put simply, a Shaman is not as cost efficient as Bolt Boys. 105 for a Shaman, 120 for Bolt Boys. There are exceptions, like obviously if you put poison on a Sludge Raker, if you want to send him in to beat up something in close combat, then that's where the Shaman's quite useful. But generally speaking, the trade-offs that you get for running more than one Shaman, I just don't think are worth it. It encourages you to run bigger Bolt Boy units, and the problem with that is simply it just makes your opponent's target priority that much easier. And I'm not running a killer boss because I'm running largely MSU, so leadership isn't that much of an issue. Typically what I've found is if something touches the Gut Rippers, they will die. If something touches the Hoggrots, they will die. Especially so because Bounty Hunters is around. So, and the kill boss is largely worthless outside of that. I've had people suggest a second Breaker boss or a second Sludge Raker. The Breaker boss one is interesting because it is one of the most efficient units in our army. I actually think it is the most efficient. But it's a 5-inch move model with quite a large clunky base. And when you can use Super Sneaky to get the first one in position, that's great. But you can only Super Sneaky one unit. And I found when I have played with two, it gets either you have to place it at the front so that it's not getting blocked by anything, in which case your opponent can quite easily kill it, or it's behind your screens, in which case actually getting it into combat is quite difficult. Just because he's quite clunky to move around with. Second Sludge Raker is quite a notable consideration. I love the Sludge Raker. I think it's quite an efficient unit. I don't own one, is a large part of why it's not here. The other main reason being that I feel like you're paying points for poison buff that you're not taking advantage of because the effect does not stack. So by running two, you're essentially only including the second poison buff as like a backup, which I don't love. I just think like I like to chase efficiency wherever I can. A couple things then to note before we finish. Other uses of Super Sneaky. I could put a Hogrot unit 9 inches away, or essentially put them in the place that I'm like. Let's say I'm up against sharks. I don't have sharks. He could fly over the Hogrots, and they have the movement to potentially shoot at something quite tasty for them. So what I can do there is I can measure where their effective movement range is. I believe they're like 14-inch movement. So if I place them in that kind of spot where they can't deploy behind the Hobgrots, they have to take sort of the long way around, then that can help protect the more valuable units behind the Hobgrots. Or if I am going up against another shooting army that have put all their eggs in one basket, like for example 15 bow snakes, I may consider going first, redeploying the 6 Bolt Boys in distance for their shorter range shot, move the Sludge Raker up so that they've got the poison buff, because 6 is to hit. If they're near a Sludge Raker, do 1 additional mortal wound if you're not aware. And that can generally clean up those sort of shooting units. But typically it's either the Breaker Boss, a unit Hobgrots or 6 Bolt Boys is getting redeployed for the reasons I just outlined. Overall thoughts of the army, I've kind of been pleasantly surprised with their effectiveness. I'm currently 6-0 with them. I had expected to lose by now. I expect I will lose when it's tournament time and the competition gets a bit fiercer. But I'm going to Carnage with realistic expectations. I'd be thrilled to go 3-2. I'd be over the moon to go 4-1. If I can podium, fantastic. I think that one of the benefits I have in playing Kruleboyz is that people will underestimate them, especially the Grinning Blade sub-faction ability, because they likely haven't played against it yet. And if I can capitalize on mistakes, the Bolt Boy army that I have has quite good ability to reach out and take out key pieces. And the army is pretty good at scoring battle tactics, largely because the Bolt Boys give me flexibility to basically take out units regardless of where they are. Where the army tends to fall down is if a hyper-aggressive army gets to double me and they've taken out my forward screens. If they can get to the unit of 6 Bolt Boys, and I tend to be in trouble. I can afford to lose 6 and still have quite high damage output. If I lose 9 and I've got 6 left, that's where things start to get a bit sketchy. But it's the best that I can do in terms of trading is use the Breaker Boss to kill a unit that's more valuable than it. The Bolt Boys focus down my opponent's best threats, and then I try and construct a victory with what I have left come round 3 or 4. And they are a high damage output army, although they're not a fast army. So if I can get the Kruleboyz wag off to fight with 3 units at once on a pivotal moment, oftentimes that can win me the game on the spot. I am planning on doing a bit more playtesting before list submission, which is this coming Friday. I don't know how many more games that I will get in. I think I'm going to make the swap of spell from the swap and Collar Shaman from Choking Mist to Levitate. But otherwise, I think this is likely to be the list that I submit. Maybe I change the grand strategy. I'm playing around in the margins. So you may see another list diary video before Carnage, but it will likely be with the same list and more sort of talking about where my head is at with the army and going into my expectations in more detail. That's if I think there's enough interesting things to say to make a video like that worthwhile. If you have any questions about the list or Kruleboyz, feel free to engage with me either in the comments section, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at LRUK. I'm always happy to talk shop with people, especially about Kruleboyz. It's a fun little puzzle to solve that not many people are bothering with because they're just not a metagame pick. If you are going for your own journey of preparing for a tournament, I'd love to see what your process is like, because it's always fun to see how different people approach preparing for a tournament. Some people will just make a list of the models that they want to play with and just paint it up for that for that tournament. Other people would want to be quite considered and methodical. I'd love to kind of hear about that sort of thing. That said, I think that we've reached a natural endpoint for this video. If you have enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and potentially subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I am aiming to do about 2 videos a week, 2 main videos, but I'm not committing to that. That's just as and when my schedule allows it. But I do plan on continuing to create shorter YouTube shorts for any individual games that I play, because I think that it's quite quick to do. It serves as a useful function for me to go back and refer to my notes on a particular game. It also helps me get sort of my immediate thoughts about a matchup to people so that they can hopefully glean some insights from it. Anyway, we're approaching the 30-minute mark, so with that I will bid you adieu. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.